Hi everyone, and welcome back to the George Collection. I'm Rachel Rightside Blonde. Those of you who know George know that John Kennedy Jr. took a lot of chances with who he interviewed and who he featured as a contributor in his magazine. He didn't care if they were left-leaning or right-leaning. He just wanted input. He wanted people to share their opinions and their thoughts about American politics. He wanted to entertain people. He wanted to educate people. And he wanted to offer up a difference of opinion so Americans could come to their own conclusions. Such a weird concept these days. It seems like we're all in echo chambers depending on which news outlet we listen to. We have Fox News on the right and we have CNN on the left. And if we never venture out of those two extremes, then we never know what our fellow Americans are hearing and what they believe. I think the concept of George is needed more now than ever. We need to be able to have friendly debate again, and we as Americans have to find a way to come together. When I first started at the revived George magazine, nothing could prepare me for the onslaught of opinions that people had based on who we didn't and who we did interview. For a few reasons I understand this, because Americans, number one, are becoming way more skeptical than they were of the news, which is a good thing. And Americans aren't used to just having people in a magazine and having to form their own opinions. We're used to being told what to think rather than coming to our own conclusions based on the information that we hear. Good, bad, ugly, indifferent. Having read many of the old George magazines, I understand that concept and understand its importance today. John Kennedy Jr. beautifully illustrated this by having Drew Barrymore featured on one of his covers, dressed as Marilyn Monroe, and in the issue I'm going to read today, interviewed his father's nemesis, Fidel Castro, 35 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis. This article can be found in the John Kennedy Tribute issue from October 1999, and it's called A Night in Havana by Inigo Thomas. Here we go. A meeting between John Kennedy and Fidel Castro on any day in any year would have been historic, yet the night the two men met had a further dimension. The son of the 35th president was meeting his father's nemesis 35 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the worst moment of the Cold War, when the end of the world seemed as likely as its survival. As John knew well, this was provocative timing for an interview with Castro. But like every journalist who has traveled to Cuba in pursuit of the dictator, John had no assurance that Castro would grant him an audience. Few things are certain in this last communist outpost, and soon after John, the photographer Herb Ritz, his assistant David Jackal, and I arrived in Havana on October 23, 1997. We realized this uncertainty included lunch. Escorted by a young man from the Foreign Ministry, John was introduced to a phalanx of pale-faced government officials. Fair skin is still a cherished status symbol on this Caribbean island. He was also shown the Bay of Pigs and the city of Santa Clara, the scene of the culminating battle of the Cuban Revolution. But after 4 lunchless days and no word of an interview, John's standing joke was that a meal before 6 p.m. was as elusive as Castro himself. It therefore seemed fitting that when John finally received a call at 5 on Sunday afternoon telling him to be ready for dinner with Castro at 9 o'clock, he thought of it as yet another late lunch. Castro reputedly has 7 homes in Havana, never sleeps in the same place 2 nights in a row, and never decides on a rendezvous until the last minute. This dinner would take place at the Council of Ministers, a large 1950s building just behind the Plaza de la Revolucion. As John readied himself at the Malia Cohiba Hotel for an interview he had described as an anvil over his head, he was acutely aware that the interview could spark as much controversy as curiosity. A small gathering of Cuban officials welcomed John at the top of the stairs, among them Ricardo Alarcon, head of the National Assembly and widely believed to be a successor to Castro, Jose Ramon Fernandez, the commander of the forces that defeated the CIA-sponsored landings at the Bay of Pigs in April 1961, and Castro's translator identified only as Juanita. They offered no clue as to the nature of the evening ahead, although John was told that a tape recorder would not be welcome. This was to be a private meeting, not an occasion for an interview. So I handed over the briefcase full of notes, microphones, and tapes to an aide, and Fernandez encouraged John to lead the group down a corridor lined with palms and tropical plants. There, in a room to the right, standing alone and dressed in green combat fatigues, was Fidel Castro Ruz. The first jokes made at Castro's expense in the 1950s, when few Cubans took his dreams of a revolution seriously, were about his beard. That once rebellious mane is now gray and thinning, and what you immediately notice about the dictator is his eyes. For a regime that prides itself on its informal manner and casual dress, how you look at people says a lot about who you are, and while most Cuban officials look away when they shake hands, Castro stares you directly in the eye, his gaze an expression of his absolute power. After Castro greeted John, he looked down and noticed the lightweight cast that protected John's right hand. He had injured it a few weeks earlier. "What have you done?" Castro asked, apparently worried that the injury had been inflicted on the island. No, John answered. This happened a while ago, in New York. Castro then formally welcomed John to Cuba. He hoped the trip had been interesting, which prompted John to give an account of his journey, the meetings with officials, the battlefields, the museums, and we never have time for lunch, he joked. Castro smiled. "We shall be having a modest supper tonight," he said. "Some shrimp, a little consommé." A waiter brought a tray of ready-mixed martinis, rum, whiskey, mango juice, and wine, and Castro began to speak about what he was currently reading, books by Churchill and Stefan Zweig, the Austrian author who fled the Nazi occupation only to commit suicide in exile in Brazil. "Tell me," Castro then inquired of John, "are you much the same size as your father?" John replied that he was young when his father died, and that his memory had been shaped in part by photographs and television, but that yes, there were similarities, although his father had been a little taller and a little thinner. With the exception of Juanita, whose ability to remember and then translate Castro's sentences seemed limitless, none of the guests had said a word since the handshake. As Castro ushered us into the dining room next door, placing John immediately opposite him, it was clear that their silence would continue for the rest of the night. Over courses of grapefruit, consommé, shrimp, chicken, and ice cream, Castro delivered one of his legendary 5-hour performances, the kind he usually gives in a town square before thousands of Cubans who have no choice but to listen. The manner in which Castro speaks doesn't lend itself to memory. His labyrinthine remarks begin with an observation or a point emphasized by extending the index finger of his right hand and drawing it close to his face. He meanders into territory that bears little relation to the original statement but eventually returns to his starting point. He expressed his amazement at Pope John Paul II's ability to wake at 5 in the morning. He applauded the socialism of the Mormon Church, and he vented his opposition to the Catholic Church's view of abortion and his belief that it would be impossible for modern Cuban women not to have the right to choose whether they wanted to have a baby. And he talked about the Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs, the great moments of the past when Cuba was at the center of the world. But it was his voice, sometimes quiet but always impassioned, that carried the evening, the meaning of his words often mattering less than the intonation. Some of his remarks, though, were particularly striking. He spoke of his admiration for President Kennedy, how brave he had been to accept the blame for the Bay of Pigs, and how U.S.-Cuban relations might have been repaired had the president lived. But the longer the evening wore on, the harder it was to absorb what we were hearing. When Castro was speaking disdainfully of President Nixon, as John recalled the following day, it was impossible not to become fixated on the lonely shrimp stuck at the end of his fork, which never made it closer than 6 inches of Castro's mouth in half an hour. Occasionally, Castro interrupted himself to ask his guests about his family and other more private aspects of his life, and John would reply with the polite discretion that he deployed in the face of his most inquisitive interviewers. Though John was patient for almost the entire night, he did show one flash of frustration. "Are you preparing an article on the missile crisis?" Castro asked. "Well, we were," John replied sardonically. At 2 in the morning, when Castro had exhausted both himself and his audience, the evening drew to a close. We stood up from the broad table that had been our theater and bid our farewells at the top of the same stairs where we'd been greeted 5 hours earlier. John thanked his host for the evening and the journey around Cuba. "I'll bring my wife next time I come," he said, "and next time I'll come on vacation." Castro grinned and said, "I hope so. There's much more to see." Then, as we walked down toward a waiting minivan, Castro and his silent subordinates waved goodbye. The following day on the plane home, I realized that Castro had said something of unexpected significance. At the time, I hadn't paid particular attention to the remark, but the more I thought about it, I recognized that the night had been leading up to this moment. As we were leaving the dining room with the cigars we had received as gifts, Castro abruptly stopped walking. "You know, Lee Harvey Oswald was trying to come here," he said, half a question, half declaration. In October 1963, Oswald had applied for a visa at the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, but his request had been denied. "Yes, I did know that," John replied. Castro paused, then said, It was a difficult time, and you know, we didn't let many Americans into Cuba. Yes. Castro lifted his head and walked on. This short exchange is a riddle of sorts, and exactly what Castro meant is impossible to say. But immediately after he heard John's last answer, a sense of relief washed over his face. Maybe he was offering a veiled apology. He knew that if Oswald had been allowed into Cuba in October 1963, then he might not have been in Dallas a month later. Sitting on the Mexicana flight back to New York, I mentioned the possibility to John. He thought about it for a few moments, nodded, and then said nothing. To go along with this reading, I'm going to read an excerpt from Matt Berman's book called JFK Jr., George, and Me, which is an awesome book if you haven't read it yet. And this is just an excerpt from his book talking about when John returned from that interview with Fidel Castro. There was no escape from John's critiques. Of course, he's talking about his critiques. When John interviewed Fidel Castro in Cuba, a British senior editor named Inigo accompanied him. On their return, John made the rounds at the office, entertaining the editors with the details of his conversation with his father's one-time nemesis. When he got to my office, knowing the interview wouldn't interest me much, he highlighted the part of the trip he knew would make me laugh. So, maestro, the day after, we all went to the beach and Inigo wore a big straw hat and had his boxers turned around so you couldn't see his hoosie. I love that he noticed the subtlest details. And just because this part is funny, I'll keep reading. The more obvious targets were like shooting fish in a barrel for John. Strolling past Rosa's desk once on a humid day in August, John said to me, "Hey Matt, is it Halloween today?" He waited a beat before adding, "Then why does Rosie have that fright wig on?" I laughed. I guess she hadn't blow-dried her hair that sticky New York summer morning, and it had sprung back into her natural curls. Like a little sister being teased by her brothers, Rose said, "Shut up, Matt, don't laugh at him," and socked John hard on his arm. I had to laugh because I knew how hard she'd be laughing when I was his target. Just funny. Great book. And also, you can read Fairy Tale Interrupted. This is by Rosie. So Matt Berman was the creative director, and Rosie was John Kennedy Jr.'s assistant. So 2 really awesome books. At The Current George, we're doing our best to carry this legacy on in terms of featuring information and letting Americans decide, trusting Americans to come to their own conclusions instead of telling them what to believe. So we hope you'll join us for the ride as we continue on, and I hope you really enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great week, and I will see you next time.
George, which is a hoot of a magazine. I thought you were a lawyer.
I was.
What happened?
Well, we decided, actually taking a cue from folks like yourself and you around the 1992 election, that there was an opportunity here to change the definition of a political magazine. Certainly the way Americans were accessing information about politics and politicians was changing. Candidates were appearing on late-night talk shows, on talk radio, on sitcoms, and there was a kind of a leveling process, and while the rest of media clearly had caught up with that, we felt that political magazines per se hadn't.
Your mother was a hell of an editor at Doubleday.
That's what I hear.
Would she have liked George?
I think she would have.